If you think about it, this war has been going on 11 and a half years. Russia started with every advantage when they invaded Ukraine in 2014. And still, with all of that, they only control about 19% of Ukrainian territory, the Donbass and Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet, you don't even hear about them anymore. The Russian Air Force does not dare to fly over Ukraine. They only launch missiles from inside Russia or over the Caspian Sea. They have not been able to interdict a single convoy of equipment and ammunition come from Poland into Ukraine, which is a colossal failure by any air force. And oh, here we are, well over 1 million casualties.
Hi, welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heapy, and today I am joined again by General Ben Hodges, former commander of the US Army in Europe. Ben, it is great to have you back on Superpowers. I think at least your second, perhaps even your third appearance. So very grateful to you for coming on again. And it's an interesting time to have you. The US journey on Ukraine of will he, won't he, has taken another turn in the last week or so. What's your assessment of, firstly, what is going on in Ukraine? Because I think an awful lot of us have come to expect that a peace deal will be forced relatively imminently and have sort of lost track of the tactical trading of territory. And I wonder if you can just give us a quick update on where the war has got to.
Well, I think that's a great way to sort of characterize this, that there is uncertainty or confusion about what the Trump administration is doing, or where the president's head and heart really are when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. Um, First, I have to say up front that I'm a skeptic. There was so much buildup about some big announcement he was going to make this past Monday with Secretary General Ruta there, and the fact that the Secretary General was there gave me some a degree of optimism that okay, something significant is going to happen. But at the end of the day, what we got was a green light for Vladimir Putin for another 50 days of doing whatever he wants without fear of any kind of retribution. I mean, why did the president feel like he needed to give Russia another 7 weeks to decide whether or not they're going to negotiate? And so while I am 100% in favor of any capability that can be given to Ukraine to help protect their population as well as to stop Russia, this whole thing really, when you boil it down, is just a big weapons sale by the United States to European countries. And I don't think it's going to happen nearly as fast as they made it sound. Um, Defense Minister Pistorius from Germany, which will probably be one of the first countries to actually hand over some of their air defense systems, he said it probably months before they're able to do that. The other thing is that, of course, Patriot, as good as it is does nothing to stop drones and glide bombs. And so I keep looking for, listening for what's the strategy? What is the strategic outcome that the United States wants, that the West wants? And negotiation is not an end state. Stopping the killing is not an end state. It should be something like we want Russia to live inside their own borders like everybody else does. If you don't have a clearly defined end state, as you know from your own experience, it's very difficult to develop and implement good policy.
Do you still believe with your military brain that if Ukraine is appropriately resourced, full sort of territorial recovery can be achieved, and that as an end state, that is still something that the West can credibly have in mind?
Yes, I absolutely believe it. I mean, if you think about it, this war has been going on 11 and a half years. Russia started with every advantage when they invaded Ukraine in 2014. And still, with all of that, they only control about 19% of Ukrainian territory, the Donbass and Crimea. The Black Sea Fleet, you don't even hear about them anymore. The Russian Air Force does not dare to fly over Ukraine. They only launch missiles from inside Russia or over the Caspian Sea. They have not been able to interdict a single convoy of equipment and ammunition come from Poland into Ukraine, which is a colossal failure by any air force. And oh, here we are, well over 1 million casualties. And Russia's economy is in trouble. I think that, and this is all done without any of us in the West committing to helping Ukraine win. I mean, we've given them just enough to help stay in the fight. So imagine if we were serious, had a clearly defined end state, and not only did we provide everything that Ukraine needed, but also we applied economic pressure. The only reason Russia's still in this fight is because they're exporting oil to India and China, which gives them enormous financial resources to keep doing what they're doing. If we applied economic pressure, we'd be having a different conversation.
So, I mean, there's a few bits to unpack in there, and we'll come to the sort of economic pressure and sanctions last. The I guess that if I know from the UK perspective, we felt that we were reaching the bottom of the things that we could get from existing inventory, and then with the increased perception of threat and a view that the UK itself might be in a war within within a decade at the most, there was a priority to revitalize and then grow our own inventory, um, which I think forces a choice. And I'd be interested to get your perspective. Whilst accepting you would want them to be able to do both support Ukraine and revitalize themselves, if European countries had to make a choice, which fiscally I think most do, would you rather see them resourcing Ukraine as the priority or revitalizing themselves?
Well, of course, I don't mean to be flip when I say yes and yes,
Yeah,
because
well,
don't, okay, I don't think it's a either or. Um, in my view, the best way to protect Europe from Russia is to see Ukraine defeat Russia. I mean, defeat them. Make sure that Russia does not accomplish their objectives, which are the destruction of Ukraine as a state and the idea of Ukraine as a state. If Russia is able to do that, then that will only be because we in the West, and including the United States, failed to do enough to help Ukraine.
mm,
And I think the Russians would perceive this as weakness or lack of will, and we would certainly look much more vulnerable. And then you're going to see what many in UK and Germany and other countries have been predicting is that Russia will continue doing what they're doing. Um, but I don't disagree with anything you said. You put it right. When nations like UK look at existing inventory, same in the US, by the way, and then you try to decide, well, we have to worry about Russia as a threat as well. We started way too late ramping up expansion of production. I mean, here we are in the year 2025, and really American artillery production only started increasing about year and a half, 2 years ago after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, but we were kind of in denial. Come on, this is not going to happen. And then people keep talking about China. Okay, well, then why haven't we been lighting fires all over America's defense industry to increase production? So our own inventory, which came into focus last week when the Secretary of Defense stopped without the president even knowing about it, stopped delivery with the excuse, well, we don't have enough of our own. Well, why the hell have we not been, going overtime industry to make more? And I would level the same critique at most of our the industry and most of our allies.
and Ben, I think you'd be entirely reasonable to do so, and that was the second part of the question. I think there's a sort of, it is extraordinary that Europe doesn't have, and America doesn't yet have the industrial capacity to both revitalize itself and to support Ukraine. It was interesting and it always jumps out at you in a way that it shouldn't. But when you say the war's been running for 11 years, i.e., from the invasion of Crimea, far too many people who are making policy in NATO capitals regard this as a war that is 3 years old. Even then, you would think that some of the biggest and most developed economies on earth would have fired up some production lines and built some factories within 3 years. But the reality is that that is not the case. Do you get any sense of um, how many European countries have so far actually fired up their industrial base? How many of them are on the right track to being able to produce at the rate necessary?
I would say almost every country in Europe has, let me say it differently. I don't hear of any countries in Europe, the big ones that are saying, "Come on, we don't need to do this. We need to keep focused on, our other programs. Or if we do build up, it just provokes Russia." I mean, there's one or two that are dragging their feet, but everybody, particularly here in Germany, but also, all the Nordics and Scandinavian countries, they're not confused about the threat, and certainly not Baltics or Poland and so on. So, and the EU is also looking for ways to push money into the processes into industry. And industry has a role to play here too. Rob Bauer, the former chairman of the military committee, said that, hey, industry, you guys have to be willing to accept some risk also. You can't sit back and say, we'd like to do it, but we need a 10-year guarantee. No government can predict 5, 10 years what the requirement's going to be. So there has to be some shared risk acceptance of risk out there. But and I think you and I might have even discussed this last time, James, if you'll allow me, though. In 1942, when Churchill came to Washington, D.C. and stayed with President Roosevelt, this was just a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. Nobody in America wanted to get involved in a land war in Europe. I mean, most of America's population were second or third generation European immigrants, and there was no interest in going back to Europe to fight a European land war. Um, so Roosevelt and Churchill agreed, though, at the Arcadia Conference in January 42, at a time when there was no reason for optimism in Great Britain or in the United States, with Germany controlling all of the European continent and Japan steadily on the move. There was no reason for optimism. These two old guys got together and said, you know what? We have to defeat Germany first so we don't lose the empire's resources or the ability to then come back and defeat Japan. And so they had strategic priority. And then in January 43 at the Casablanca conference, they agreed on an end state. Again, January 43, no reason for optimism. They agreed on an end state of unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. And this is what enabled the United States to ramp up production. And we went from having an army that was number 17 in the world, right behind Bulgaria, to having 12 million women and men in uniform by just 3 years later. So it boils down to, if you want to increase capability, you have political will. You put money on it, and civilian leaders have to explain to the population what is at stake and what will happen if we fail to do this. That's what we've been missing. I still believe in the potential that's out there, but it takes leadership.
And do you think that the narrative of deterrence, the strategic, I mean, so there is an end that you would will in Ukraine that is favorable to the Western interest, but fundamentally the strategic end that that NATO countries are aiming for is the restoration of conventional deterrence. And that's a very different sell to that discussion in 1942 around the ending of Nazi Germany and the ending of the Japanese Empire. Um, do, are European publics ready to see the fiscal decisions necessary simply for the purposes of restoring deterrence, which is so much less tangible than a territorial victory?
Yeah, I think if you say deterrence, or even something that is very achievable, which is Russia lives inside its own borders, its sovereign, internationally recognized borders, that is very achievable. But you would have to explain to the average American or British voter and taxpayer, why does that matter? What's this about? First of all, this war in Ukraine right now is what failed deterrence looks like because we, the collective we, did nothing after they invaded Georgia. We
Mm.
did nothing after they invaded Crimea. We did nothing after they jumped over President Obama's red line in Syria. We did nothing. That's particularly the US and UK. And then in going back, we failed to live up to our agreement for the Budapest Memorandum to support Ukraine after they gave up their nuclear weapons. And so a long, steady stream of us failing to address Russia and accept that Russia was a threat and had no good intentions is why I think in February of 2022, the Russians felt confident that they could go ahead and finish the job in Ukraine because the West was not really going to do anything. And we looked a mess, American um, domestic situation with our January 6th and, the Trump Biden, all that was a mess. Germany was still building Nord Stream 2. So you could imagine why the Kremlin would say, let's finish the job. So now look at the cost
Yeah.
because deterrence failed. Now look at the cost. And then more practical, because that still won't be compelling for a lot of people. Although I will say my best source of information are London taxi drivers. I mean, these guys, they know what's going on because of who they hear and they listen to the radio and so on. Um, Food and energy prices, you can tag that directly to what Russia has done in Ukraine, how that's affected because of the disruption of food and energy coming out of Ukraine. Millions of Ukrainian refugees, that puts an enormous burden on European governments and economies and social systems. All of these things are the results of what Russia has done. So there are tangible reasons. And then finally, China. China is watching to see, can we in the West get our act together? Do we have the will to really enforce sovereignty and to enforce international law, freedom of navigation, things that may matter greatly to British voters and taxpayers? China's watching to see, are we serious about this?
Ben, you mentioned a few minutes ago the decision within the DoD. You credited Hegseth. I've heard most people tell me it was Bridge Colby, but either way, somebody in the DoD decided that it couldn't afford to honor the commitment of lethal aid that the president had made. Why why aren't the Russians faced with the same calculus? Is if, as you've just set out, the whole of NATO has finally got into gear and is on the right journey towards rearmament, why isn't the Bridge Colby in the Kremlin saying we can't keep attriting ourselves in Ukraine because the NATO overmatch is becoming too much of a strategic risk to Russia?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I suspect that the Russian counterpart to Mr. Colby or Secretary Hegseth, that they are saying that. Of course, I don't think we have the same degree of transparency about what's going on there that maybe we used to have understanding, Kremlin thinking. Um, and I think Vladimir Putin is not going to be swayed by those kinds of arguments. He clearly doesn't care about how many casualties they have. It looks like they're getting around 30,000 North Korean troops to come in and bolster what they're doing. I spoke just 2 weeks ago with a Ukrainian senior officer, longtime friend of mine, who said that about 50% of the ammunition that Russia uses comes from North Korea. China, of course, is interested in seeing us stuck in this war with Ukraine somehow to delay our ability to do more in the Indo-Pacific region. Um, so there's a lot of factors that are contributing to Russia's ability to keep doing what they're doing. Most importantly, their ability to continue exporting oil through the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea using these shadow fleet vessels to get it out to where they can then transload it to more seaworthy vessels out in the ocean. So we just haven't used all the tools that we could to cripple Russia, and that's already, I think, in a pretty frail state economically. Of course, President Putin doesn't have to worry about, there is no question time for President Putin the way your prime minister has to deal with that, or even President Trump having to answer to media or deal with the Congress. And so it's just a different set of circumstances. I am sure, though, that there are people in the Kremlin that are thinking, you know, we have got to, we are very vulnerable now. We, Russia, are very vulnerable to attack because of where we are economically and militarily.
Just as you were talking about the Korean contribution particularly, you start to wonder whether or not it's not a mutual defense pact. It's much more transactional than that between Pyongyang and Moscow. But the prospect of the North Koreans turning up in the Western Military District and the Northern Fleet Military District, facing off against NATO is a fascinating thing to start to consider. It also underlines the interconnectedness of the EuroAtlantic and Indo-Pacific theatres, and I think those European politicians of late have really tried to sort of separate the two theatres to justify Europe first mentality. I think that's a cognitive dissonance that doesn't play out strategically.
I think you're exactly right. And Secretary General Ruta just recently, maybe within the last 2 weeks, talked about his assessment that China and Russia would cooperate not in a traditional allied sense, but more in terms of coordinating their activities. That if China decided it was ready to do something, that it would tell Russia, okay, we need you to, and that they might provide some capabilities there. And then the SACEUR yesterday morning was here speaking at a conference in Wiesbaden, and he said the same thing, of course, that the possibility of having to fight in both theaters, that these are connected. And so if you accept, and I do, and I sense that you do, that these are all connected, that Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China, it makes sense, much like Churchill and Roosevelt, who decided to defeat Nazi Germany first. If we help Ukraine defeat Russia first, that adds to the further isolation of Iran, which is already in deep trouble, of course. North Korea has no friends elsewhere. And then I think China would say, okay, well, the West really is serious. And I also would think that this is a great time to do a major exercise in South Korea. I mean, we have a lot of troops there, along with our Iraq allies, but a major exercise to make Kim Jong-un remember. You start sending away 30,000 soldiers and all of, so much ammunition. This is a good time to put pressure on him from the South.
Yes. You mentioned earlier the Russian economy, and I think war is principally, most visibly, an armed conflict, but ultimately it is an economic struggle. Whoever can sort of sustain themselves longest invariably wins. Why is the Russian economy not yet completely on its knees? Why has a global system that the West broadly controls failed to fully impose the necessary sanctions regime on Russia?
I think we've got American companies, I suspect British companies, and plenty of other European companies that are in violation of sanctions or looking the other way. India has been one of the major violators of almost like a money laundering type operation that allows parts and things that the Russians need as for components. They end up making their way through India, and China also is doing this. And then, of course, it's pretty well known that, all of a sudden, Kazakhstan has become a massive importer of German automobiles. So I think when you look at all the different ways that the loopholes are out there and people are willing, there's money to be made that violate the sanctions. About half, I don't want to put a specific number on it, but let's just say a very large percentage of the Shadow Fleet vessels are all Greek. I mean, this is a NATO ally, an EU country, and they're the ones that are helping move oil into India and China. So this is where I think leadership from the United States and UK and Germany and France would be so important to not only um, provide capabilities and making it a priority that Russia is forced to live within its own borders, but also these are the countries that really can pull the levers for much of the economic power in the world. Now, I'm not naive. Ambassador Dan Fried is the best U.S. sanctions expert I know, and he talked about the tedious work that has to be done to track down all of these things. And of course, the Russians have long since moved things away so that their daughter is the owner of the company, not the head of the family. Silly stuff like that. But it's tedious, hard government work, and we just haven't put our shoulder to the wheel on it.
And that's if there was a renewed impetus for doing that and a willingness to be robust with the Indians, the Emiratis, and others where sort of Russian money is flowing. Um, how quickly would that change the dynamic for the Russians in Ukraine?
Well, they'd have to believe that it was really going to happen for starters. And I think in most cases, economic tools generally will take time for their effect to be really felt. But I would say that UK was one of the first countries to start blacklisting these shadow fleet vessels. I think you're up
Mm.
well over 100 of these have been done already. Now they're replaceable, but nonetheless, that does have a disruptive effect. Germany and I think two other countries that are on the Baltic Sea have begun stopping shadow fleet vessels checking for insurance papers, for example. Uh, I think if you were to do a safety inspection of most of them, what the EU's sanctions commissioner, Mr. O'Sullivan, says, he describes them as end of life vessels. So you can start doing things like that that disrupt Russia's ability to export oil. And then, of course, there's this famous 300 billion euro that are frozen that should be used to pay for stuff for Ukraine. That would have an impact. I'm not an economist, as you've already spotted, but somebody told me that a lot of loans inside of Russia are tied to that 300 billion. And so that would start having ripple effects on people, on the domestic side inside of Russia.
Ben, in the few minutes we've got left, can I take you into the capability space? Just fascinated to get your perspective, 6 months, I think, since we spoke last, on the evolution of the technology in the battle space, and your confidence that NATO militaries are actively transforming to reflect what we've learned in Ukraine? Or equally valid, is there a danger that the lessons we're learning in Ukraine are not applicable to NATO force structures because of the way that NATO intends to fight?
I think that you'd have a hard time finding any ministry official or senior officer that was not aware of the changing character of war. I mean, it's on the front of everybody's mind. The challenge is how do we get to that additional capability? How can we procure faster? How can what are the Ukrainians doing that is so effective that we can in fact copy or adapt within our own procurement systems? The Ukrainians are doing incredible things, but they can't do it to the scale necessary or that UK or the US might need for global requirements. So I think that in the US, it feels like in some cases, we're trying to do it inside the US Army, for example, but it seems pitifully slow because I don't know that we've found the workarounds or how do you break out of our cumbersome procurement process. The air defense. Uh, this is an area where I think I heard so many things over the last few days of technologies that are being developed to counter drones. I mean, since the first guy picked up a knife and the other guy picked up a shield, there's always been this race, to counter each other's capabilities. And so, not surprisingly, there are a lot of industry efforts to um, create counter drone capabilities that are kinetic, non-kinetic, the full range of things. Uh, there's a growing understanding that air and missile defense requires more than just Patriot or more than just Stinger. I mean, it's the full range of capabilities because the weapons that are coming in against you are a wide range of things in huge numbers. So it feels like we're starting to do a little bit more, take that more seriously. Um, but that is our biggest vulnerability. And I think if we had to go through a day of what Ukrainians go through every day, we would be in big trouble.
Yeah, I was talking to some Ukrainian friends in the last couple of days as well, and they were describing to me the sort of the nature of the kind of nightly drone battle and um and just the sort of and the economics of that exchange. You've got the Russians will hide the Shaheeds, which are the drones that are going to deliver the kinetic effect for viewers that are not familiar, um, in amongst a whole bunch of decoys.
Yeah.
And so you've got a choice to kind of effectively expend almost an entire Patriot battery to take out one or two actual Shaheeds and then a bunch of dummies, which is a grotesquely expensive endeavor and far more being spent in defense than in offense. And that's not sustainable. And so they were sort of describing that there's a really urgent need to be able to defend against drones, whether it's kinetic. I mean, non-kinetic is brilliant because it's very inexpensive. But if a kinetic defense is required, it's got to be at a price comparable with the value of the asset you're seeking to defeat.
Yeah. And of course, as you know, from the beginning of time, there's never been, or from the beginning of air power, there's never been enough capabilities to protect everything. So commanders and leaders are always going to have to prioritize what must be protected and then where are you willing to accept some risk. And I don't think anybody's going to launch a Patriot against a drone, especially if there's 300 of them coming in at one time. What I do imagine is happening, and I think we're probably closer to it than we realize, than I would know, is that use of artificial intelligence allowing swarms of drones to go up against the incoming swarm, and then the artificial intelligence being able to direct drone on drone. That's my. I think this is going to be one of the main ways to stop those things. I have seen the Rheinmetall has produced a weapon called Skynex, which looks like a modernized version of their Gepard, which is able to track Shahed drones and shoot them down, which was impressive. Um, my Ukrainian friend told me the thing he fears the most is the glide bomb. He said even if it lands, it's not precise, but if you're within 500 meters, that thing is going to really rattle your brain. And so that's a hard thing to stop unless you can shoot down the aircraft, which don't come into Ukrainian airspace. So it's a whole system of systems that are required, both in terms of early warning and then detection, and then of course, exactly as you pointed out, the drone problem. I mean, the decoys that are out there. Now, the Ukrainians have also been very effective at use of decoys on the ground, so that a lot of drones and other Russian weapons go against plywood mock-ups.
I'll be really interested to see. I expect I will see you there in about 6 weeks' time. We will all be gathering in London for the DSCI Defence exhibition, and I wonder whether when you most people watching this will not have been to DSCI, but when you walk into this vast exhibition hall, what you tend to be seeing is, as far as the eye can see, tanks and armored personnel carriers and the things that you would associate with the war of sort of previous decades. I wonder, Ben, if when we walk in this year, because it's done biannually, and in 2023, I don't think that we were all thinking about air defense and drone exchanges in the way that we are now. I wonder if it will be visibly different. Will we see an entirely new take on defense?
Well, we certainly should see evidence of industry's energy trying to produce capabilities that are relevant to what we need now and in the coming 5 to 10 years, which requires some risk taking on the industry side, as well as some vision, some cooperation between the services and the ministries and industry. Um, I think one of the things that jacks the price up the most is when we keep changing the requirement. So finding a way to be consistent on the requirement is a way to make this a little bit more financially sustainable as well. I also anticipate, or we already see, more and more joint ventures where you've got U.S. companies partnering with European companies. The Brits are doing the same thing, of course. Um, I think it's not going to be sustainable where you have just standalone own nation things. You can't, I don't think that's what the market is going to reward.
Really interesting. Ben, it's always a treat to speak to you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us this week. You've been watching Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical content, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. But for now, thanks very much. See you next week.